Nestled deep in the shadowed valleys of the Catskills stood an ancient mansion, its weathered walls whispering secrets of lives long forgotten. Among its hidden relics lay a cursed tarot deck, dormant for centuries, waiting for unsuspecting hands to unleash its power. It was said that the deck, once owned by a vengeful astrologer, held the fates of all who dared to wield it. Each card drawn wasn't just a prediction, it was a death sentence. When a group of college friends reunited for a weekend of celebration and nostalgia, they stumbled upon the fateful deck, mistaking its allure for innocent fun. What began as a harmless game quickly spiraled into a chilling nightmare as the cards foretold their demise. With every card flipped, a sinister force awakened, stalking them one by one, turning their destinies into their worst fears. As the friends grapple with their unfolding fates, the true horror of the cursed tarot deck reveals itself. Burdened by guilt, betrayal, and desperation, they must confront the ancient evil before it claims them all. But can they escape what was written in the cards, or will the deck's dark prophecy seal their doom forever? Welcome to Tarot, where fate is a deadly game, and the cards never lie. Chapter 1. The Reunion. The air was crisp and biting as Haley adjusted her scarf, watching her breath fog in the cold twilight. The mansion loomed ahead, its Gothic spires silhouetted against the deepening sky. A once grand estate, it now seemed out of place, its decayed elegance contrasting sharply with the vibrant, youthful energy of the group gathered on its wide stone steps. Haley felt a shiver run down her spine, not from the cold, but from the oppressive weight of the building's presence. "Haley, over here." Elise's voice broke through her thoughts. Elise, ever the social butterfly, waved enthusiastically, her fiery red curls catching the last of the setting sun. Haley forced a smile and trudged up the steps, her boots crunching on the gravel. The reunion had been Elise's idea, as most of their social events were. Despite the tension that had brewed between certain members of the group over the years, Elise was determined to bring everyone back together for her birthday weekend. She'd rented the mansion, proclaiming it the perfect mix of mystery and charm. "Isn't this place incredible?" Elise gushed as Haley reached her. "It's got history, it's got character, and it's ours for the whole weekend." Haley nodded, her gaze drifting to the mansion's towering windows. Some of the panes were cracked, others covered in grime. "It's definitely something," she muttered. Behind her, the rest of the group arrived, their chatter filling the air. Grant, tall and brooding, carried an armful of firewood, his jaw tight as he avoided Haley's gaze. Paige, always the optimist, was snapping pictures of the mansion with her phone, commenting on how perfectly spooky it all was. Madeline and Lucas, inseparable as always, were laughing about something, their voices a comforting counterpoint to the growing unease Haley felt. "All right, everyone." Elise clapped her hands. "Let's get inside and explore before it gets too dark." The group filed through the heavy oak doors, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive and eerie than the outside. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals coated in decades of dust. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the group as they moved. "This is amazing," Paige whispered, snapping a photo of the staircase that spiraled up into darkness. "It's also freezing," Grant grumbled, setting the firewood down by an ornate hearth. "We need to get a fire going before we all freeze to death." As they divided up tasks, some to start the fire, others to explore the house, Haley found herself wandering alone. She drifted through the grand dining room, its long table still set with tarnished silverware, and into the library, where rows of books leaned precariously on sagging shelves. She stopped in front of a glass cabinet, its contents obscured by years of grime. Curious, she opened it, revealing a collection of strange artifacts. A tarnished brass telescope, a faded map of constellations, and a wooden box intricately carved with occult symbols. The box drew her in. Its craftsmanship was exquisite, the carvings so detailed they seemed to pulse under her touch. She opened it carefully, revealing a deck of tarot cards, their edges worn with age. The artwork was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Each card was a masterpiece of dark, intricate imagery. "Haley!" Elise's voice startled her, and she nearly dropped the box. Elise appeared in the doorway, her eyes lighting up when she saw the cards. "What did you find?" "A tarot deck," Haley said, holding it up. "It's beautiful, but it feels off." Elise laughed, brushing off her concern. "Perfect. Let's do a reading tonight. It'll be fun." Haley hesitated, but eventually relented. If nothing else, it would be a way to distract herself from the lingering tension with Grant. That evening, after dinner, the group gathered in the mansion's parlor. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Haley sat at the center, the tarot deck in her hands. "All right," Elise said, her excitement palpable. "Who's first?" One by one, the friends stepped forward. Elise drew the High Priestess, and Paige teased her about always being the wise one of the group. Lucas pulled the Hermit, which prompted laughs about his introverted tendencies. Madeline drew the Hanged Man, and she joked about her yoga skills. Paige received the Magician, her card greeted with applause for her knack for fixing anything. Then it was Grant's turn. Haley's heart clenched as he approached, their eyes briefly meeting before she looked away. He shuffled the cards and drew the Devil. The room fell silent, the jovial atmosphere evaporating. Grant scoffed, trying to brush it off. "Figures," he muttered, tossing the card back onto the table. Finally, it was Haley's turn. Her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled the deck. She drew a card and turned it over. Death. The group stared at the card, its stark imagery sending a chill through the room. "It doesn't mean literal death," Haley said quickly, her voice shaky. "It symbolizes transformation. Change." Elise tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but the unease lingered. The game was quickly abandoned, and the group retreated to their respective rooms, the earlier camaraderie replaced by an unspoken tension. That night, as Haley lay in her creaky bed, the events of the day replayed in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that the cards had been more than just a game. The imagery, the weight of the deck in her hands, it all felt too real. A soft sound drew her attention. She sat up, straining to hear. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a whispering, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the parlor. Grabbing a flashlight, she crept out of her room and down the hall. The mansion was deathly silent, the air thick with a foreboding stillness. When she reached the parlor, the whispering stopped. The tarot deck lay untouched on the table, its cards fanned out as if inviting her to draw again. Haley took a step back, her pulse quickening. She turned to leave, but as she did, the flashlight flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart thundered in her chest as she stumbled back to her room, locking the door behind her. That night, sleep eluded her. As the hours dragged on, the mansion seemed to come alive, its walls groaning, its shadows shifting. And through it all, the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent, as if the house itself was trying to tell her something. By morning, the sun's light did little to dispel the lingering dread. Haley joined the others in the dining room, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Rough night?" Paige asked, noticing her pallor. "You could say that," Haley replied, forcing a weak smile. As the group planned their activities for the day, Haley couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the cards had awakened something in the house, something that wasn't going to let them leave unscathed. Chapter 2. The Discovery. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the mansion's grimy windows, casting pale streaks of light across the dining room. The group sat around a rickety table, finishing their breakfast. Despite the cheery clink of cutlery and occasional bursts of laughter, there was an undercurrent of tension that no one wanted to acknowledge. Haley sat quietly, stirring her coffee. She barely touched her food, her mind fixated on the events of the previous night. The whispers, the feeling of being watched, none of it made sense, yet the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. "All right, folks," Elise announced, her voice overly chipper as if determined to shake off the gloom. "I say we split up and explore this place. There's got to be some cool stuff hidden around here." "I'm in," Paige said, grinning. "Let's see what kind of treasures this creepy old house is hiding." Haley hesitated, but eventually agreed. Maybe staying busy would help her shake the sense of dread. The group paired off. Elise and Paige went upstairs. Madeline and Lucas headed for the kitchen and cellar, while Haley found herself, to her dismay, stuck with Grant. "Guess it's just us," Grant said awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. Haley nodded, avoiding his gaze. They had barely spoken since the breakup, and the unspoken tension between them was palpable. They wandered into the library, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and mildew. Haley trailed her fingers along the dusty spines of the books, trying to distract herself from the oppressive silence between them. "Remember when we used to do this?" Grant said suddenly, his voice soft. Back in college, sneaking into the old library after hours? Haley froze, memories flooding back. Those nights had been some of their happiest, before everything fell apart. That was a long time ago, she replied, her tone neutral. Grant sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, Haley, I know I screwed up. Don't, she interrupted, turning to face him. This isn't the time or place to rehash everything. Before he could respond, a loud crash echoed from somewhere below. Both of them jumped, exchanging a worried glance. What the hell was that? Grant muttered. They followed the sound to the basement, where they found Madeline and Lucas staring at a shattered shelf. Sorry, Madeline said sheepishly. Lucas bumped into it. Not my fault, it was already falling apart, Lucas grumbled, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Amid the mess of broken wood and scattered objects, something caught Haley's eye. It was another wooden box, smaller but similar in design to the one she had found the tarot deck in. She picked it up carefully, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. What's that? Paige asked, appearing at the top of the stairs with Elise. Not sure, Haley replied, opening the box. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Ooh, a diary, Elise said, bounding down the stairs. This just got interesting. Haley flipped through the journal, the handwriting spidery and uneven. The entries were dated from the late 18th century, written by someone named Evelyn Moreau. The name sparked a vague memory, but Haley couldn't place it. What does it say? Paige asked, leaning over her shoulder. It's hard to make out, Haley said, squinting at the faded ink. She read aloud. November 3rd, 1798. The deck is complete. Each card imbued with the essence of its celestial counterpart. But the cost, oh, the cost. The deck, Elise echoed, her excitement growing. Do you think it's talking about the tarot cards? Haley nodded slowly, her unease deepening. It seems like it. Evelyn mentions a ritual and a curse. Grant frowned, leaning in to look at the journal. A curse? What kind of curse? Haley skimmed the pages, the entries becoming increasingly erratic. Phrases like power beyond comprehension and the cards demand balance stood out. Then she found something that made her stomach drop. To use the cards is to invite their judgment. Each draw seals a fate, each reading invokes their wrath. The deck does not forgive. It does not forget. Okay, that's officially creepy, Paige said, stepping back. Maybe we should just put it back, Lucas suggested, his usual light-hearted tone gone. Put it back, Elise scoffed. This is amazing. We've stumbled onto something straight out of a horror movie. Come on, don't tell me you're scared. Yeah, well, those movies usually end with everyone dead, Madeline muttered. Elise rolled her eyes. It's just a journal. Nothing's going to happen. Haley wasn't so sure. She could still feel the weight of the tarot deck in her hands from the previous night, the way it seemed to pulse with energy. Maybe Lucas is right, she said cautiously. This isn't just some game. What if it's dangerous? You're overthinking it, Elise said dismissively. Let's just finish exploring and have some fun. We came here to celebrate, remember? Reluctantly, the group dispersed again, but the discovery of the journal had left a mark. The light-hearted banter was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of unease. Later that afternoon, Haley found herself alone in the parlor, staring at the tarot deck. She had placed it back in its box, but it still seemed to call to her, its presence almost magnetic. Against her better judgment, she opened the box and pulled out the cards. The artwork was just as unsettling as she remembered, each image intricate and haunting. She shuffled the deck, the cards feeling almost alive in her hands. Without thinking, she drew a card. It was the tower. The image showed a crumbling tower struck by lightning, figures falling from its heights. A chill ran down Haley's spine as she stared at the card, the sense of impending doom overwhelming. Haley, she jumped, nearly dropping the card. Grant stood in the doorway, his expression concerned. What are you doing? Nothing, she said quickly, shoving the card back into the deck. Grant frowned, but didn't press the issue. The others are heading out to explore the grounds. You coming? Haley hesitated, her gaze lingering on the tarot deck. Yeah, she said finally. I'll be right there. As she followed Grant outside, the words from the journal echoed in her mind. The deck does not forgive. It does not forget. She tried to shake the feeling of dread, but it clung to her like a shadow, refusing to let go. For the rest of the day, the group tried to enjoy themselves, but the mansion's oppressive atmosphere made it difficult. Even Elise, usually the life of the party, seemed subdued. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the mansion took on an even more sinister air. That evening, as the group gathered around the fire, Haley couldn't help but feel that they weren't alone. The shadows seemed to move, the air thick with an unspoken tension. And through it all, the tarot deck sat on the table, its cards whispering promises of things yet to come. None of them could have known that the cards had already chosen their fates, and that the night ahead would mark the beginning of their descent into horror. Chapter 3. Shadows Unveiled. The night settled heavily over the mansion, its oppressive stillness broken only by the occasional creak of its ancient bones. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal branches of the surrounding forest, but inside, the air was suffocatingly still. The group sat in the parlor, huddled around the fire, the flickering flames casting ghostly shadows on the walls. Elise, ever the optimist, tried to keep the mood light. "Okay, so we found an old journal that talks about curses. Big deal. It's just a story, right? Nothing's actually going to happen." Paige nodded hesitantly. "Right. I mean, people used to believe all sorts of crazy stuff. Maybe Evelyn Moreau was just eccentric." Grant leaned back in his chair, his expression dark. "Eccentric or not, you have to admit, there's something weird about this place. That deck isn't normal." Madeline crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the fire. "So what do we do? Just leave? We've only been here one day." Lucas snorted. "I don't know about you, but I'm not about to let some spooky vibes ruin the weekend. Let's just steer clear of the creepy cards and have a good time." Haley remained silent, her thoughts elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the card she had drawn earlier, the tower. The image of the crumbling tower and the figures falling to their doom haunted her. It felt like a warning, though she couldn't say why. "I'm going to bed," she said abruptly, standing up. "Already?" Elise asked, frowning. Haley nodded. "I'm just tired. It's been a long day." Without waiting for a response, she left the parlor and headed upstairs. The hallway was dark and silent, the faint light from her phone barely illuminating the way. As she reached her room, she hesitated. The mansion felt alive, its walls pulsing with an unseen energy. Shaking off the unease, she stepped inside and locked the door. She changed into her pajamas and climbed into bed, pulling the blankets tightly around her. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the day. The journal, the cards, the whispers, it all felt connected, but she couldn't piece it together. As the hours ticked by, her exhaustion finally won out, and she drifted into a restless sleep. Haley woke with a start, her heart pounding. At first, she wasn't sure what had roused her. The room was dark, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind outside. But then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. She sat up, her eyes scanning the room. The sound was coming from the door. Tap, tap, tap. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped. She waited, holding her breath, but there was no response. After a moment, she got out of bed and approached the door, her pulse racing. She unlocked it and opened it slowly, peering into the hallway. It was empty. Haley frowned, stepping out into the corridor. The mansion was eerily silent, the shadows stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. She turned to go back to her room, but as she did, she caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. It was tall and unnaturally still, its presence sending a chill down her spine. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. Haley backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned and ran, her bare feet pounding against the cold wooden floor. She didn't stop until she reached the parlor, where the fire had burned down to embers. The room was empty, but the tarot deck sat on the table, its cards spread out as if waiting for her. She stared at it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The deck seemed to pulse with energy, drawing her in despite her fear. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But as she turned to leave, a card slid off the deck and landed face up on the table. Haley froze, her gaze drawn to the card. It was the tower. Again, a cold, hollow laugh echoed through the room, sending a wave of terror through her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, forming shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Haley stumbled back, her legs weak. She needed to wake the others. Whatever was happening, she couldn't face it alone. The group gathered in the parlor, their faces pale and tense. Haley had woken them one by one, her panicked knocking rousing them from uneasy sleep. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Paige asked, though her voice lacked conviction. I know what I saw, Haley insisted. There was someone in the hallway. And the deck, it moved on its own. Lucas frowned, rubbing his temples. Okay, so what do we do? Burn the damn cards. That might make things worse, Madeline said quietly. If this is supernatural, destroying the cards could backfire. You can't seriously believe this, Elise said, though her usual confidence was wavering. It's just a deck of cards. Grant crossed his arms, his expression grim. Whatever it is, it's not just a deck of cards. And if Haley's right, we're in serious trouble. Haley looked at the others, desperation in her eyes. The journal mentioned a curse. Maybe there's something in it that can help us. The group agreed reluctantly and returned to the basement to retrieve the journal. As Haley flipped through its pages, a pattern began to emerge. Evelyn Moreau had created the deck as part of a ritual to harness celestial power, but the ritual had gone horribly wrong. The cards had become vessels for dark forces, each one linked to a specific fate. There's a way to stop it, Haley said, her voice trembling. But it's dangerous. What does it say? Grant asked. Haley hesitated, then read aloud. To sever the deck's hold, the cycle must be completed. Each card must be drawn, and its fate fulfilled. Only then can the curse be broken. The room fell silent as the weight of the words sank in. So, we have to draw the cards? Paige asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Not just draw them, Haley said. We have to face whatever fate they reveal. That's insane, Lucas said, shaking his head. There's no way we're doing that. Do we have a choice? Grant asked. If we leave it alone, it might get worse. The group argued late into the night, but no consensus was reached. Tensions ran high, and fear hung over them like a shroud. As they finally retreated to their rooms, the tarot deck remained on the table, its cards waiting patiently for their next victim. Haley lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The shadows seemed to move with a will of their own, and the whispers had returned, growing louder with each passing moment. Chapter 4. The First Draw. The next morning arrived with an unsettling stillness. The air inside the mansion felt thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was alive and aware of its occupants. Haley was the first to wake, her sleep fractured by strange dreams of the tarot deck and the mysterious figure in the hallway. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, the weight of the previous night's revelations pressing heavily on her chest. Downstairs, she found Elise in the kitchen making coffee. Elise looked up, her usual confident demeanor dimmed, though she tried to mask it with a weak smile. Morning, Elise said, handing Haley a mug. Morning, Haley replied, taking the coffee. She didn't have the energy for small talk. One by one, the others trickled in, their faces pale and drawn. The mood was somber as they gathered in the parlor, the tarot deck still sitting ominously on the table. No one wanted to mention it, but its presence was impossible to ignore. I couldn't sleep, Paige admitted, breaking the silence. I kept hearing noises. Same, Madeline said, wrapping her arms around herself. It felt like someone was watching me. Lucas leaned against the wall, his jaw tight. We can't stay here. I don't care what the journal says. This place is cursed. We need to leave. Grant nodded. Agreed. Let's pack up and go. Forget the cards, forget the curse. We'll figure something out later. Haley hesitated, glancing at the journal still sitting beside the deck. What if leaving makes it worse? She asked. The journal says the curse doesn't just go away. If we don't deal with it now, it could follow us. That's a risk I'm willing to take, Lucas said. I'm not staying here another night. Elise frowned, her gaze flicking between the group and the deck. What if she's right? What if this thing is attached to us now? Running won't help. The debate grew heated, voices rising as fear and frustration boiled over. Finally, Elise slammed her hands on the table, silencing everyone. Enough, she snapped. We're not going to solve anything by arguing. Let's just draw one card. If nothing happens, we leave. If something does happen, we'll figure it out. That's insane, Lucas said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's better than sitting around waiting for something to happen, Elise argued. She picked up the deck, her hands trembling slightly. I'll do it. I'll draw the first card. No, Haley said quickly. We should draw in order. If the curse is tied to us, it might demand all of us to face it. Elise hesitated, then nodded. Fine. Who's first? The group exchanged uneasy glances before Haley sighed and stepped forward. I'll go, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She took the deck from Elise, the cards feeling unnaturally heavy in her hands. The artwork on the back seemed to shift and writhe as she shuffled, the patterns mesmerizing and unsettling. Finally, she drew a card and placed it face up on the table. It was the Hermit. The card depicted an old man holding a lantern, standing on the edge of a cliff. Haley stared at it, her heart pounding. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elise grabbed the journal and flipped through the pages, scanning the descriptions. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry. "The Hermit represents introspection, solitude, and enlightenment. But it also warns of isolation and the danger of losing oneself in the darkness." As the words left Elise's mouth, the fire in the hearth flickered and dimmed, casting the room into deep shadow. A cold wind swept through the parlor, though the windows were closed. "What's happening?" Paige asked, her voice trembling. Haley suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to leave. The air seemed to press in on her, suffocating and oppressive. Without thinking, she turned and walked out of the room, the others calling after her. "Haley, wait!" Grant shouted, but she didn't stop. Her feet carried her up the stairs and down the hallway to the attic. The door creaked open as she approached, revealing a narrow staircase leading upward. She climbed without hesitation, her movements mechanical, as though controlled by an unseen force. The attic was dark and filled with forgotten relics, dusty trunks, broken furniture, and cobweb-covered paintings. In the center of the room stood a tall mirror, its surface covered by a heavy black cloth. Haley approached it, her breath shallow. She reached out and pulled the cloth away, revealing a full-length mirror with an ornate frame. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The reflection was too still, its eyes too sharp. "Haley," the reflection said, its voice hollow and echoing. Haley staggered back, her heart racing. "Who? What are you?" "I am you," the reflection said. "The part of you you've hidden away. The fear, the doubt, the darkness. You cannot escape me." Haley shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't real. It's just a nightmare." The reflection stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural. "Face me, or be consumed by the darkness," it said. Haley closed her eyes, her mind racing. She thought of the journal, of the card's warning. Introspection, solitude, enlightenment. She had to confront whatever this was. Opening her eyes, she stepped toward the mirror, her reflection mirroring her movements. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice trembling but determined. The reflection smiled, a cold, sharp grin. "We'll see." The room seemed to dissolve around her, the shadows swallowing everything. Haley felt herself falling, her mind spiraling into the depths of her own fears and doubts. She saw fragments of her past, her parents' divorce, her breakup with Grant, the self-doubt that had haunted her for years. But as the memories threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered the lantern in the card's image. The light in the darkness. Focusing on that thought, she reached deep within herself and found a spark of courage. The shadows began to recede, the light growing stronger until the attic came back into focus. Haley stood before the mirror, her reflection smiling softly. "You found your light," it said. "Hold on to it." The mirror shattered, the sound echoing through the attic. Haley stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she looked again, the mirror was gone, and the attic was silent. She returned to the parlor, her face pale but resolute. The others stared at her, their expressions a mix of fear and awe. "What happened?" Grant asked. Haley sat down, her hands trembling. "I faced it," she said. "Whatever this curse is, it's not just about the cards. It's about us. Our fears, our darkness. We have to confront it, or it will destroy us." The group fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. One card had been drawn, one fate fulfilled. But the deck was far from finished, and the horrors it promised were only just beginning. Chapter 5. The Devil's Deal. The atmosphere in the mansion had shifted once more. It was no longer merely ominous. It was oppressive, as if the house itself was tightening its grip on the group. After Haley's harrowing experience, no one dared to draw another card that night. Instead, they sat together in the parlor, the tarot deck still resting on the table like a predator waiting for its next move. By morning, the tension had only deepened. The sunlight streaming through the windows did little to lift the shadows that seemed to cling to every corner. The group ate breakfast in near silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. Finally, it was Lucas who broke the stillness, slamming his coffee mug onto the table. "This is ridiculous. We're letting a stupid deck of cards control us. If we just ignore it, it'll stop." Haley shook her head, her voice firm. That's not how it works. The curse won't go away. It's tied to us now. Lucas scoffed. And you know this because of some creepy journal written by a dead woman? Come on. This is just a bunch of superstitious nonsense. It's not nonsense, Madeline said quietly. You saw what happened to Haley. She didn't just imagine that. Lucas opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Haley's eyes silenced him. Her ordeal had left a mark on her, a weight that none of them could deny. So what's the plan? Gran asked. We can't just sit here forever. Haley took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the deck. We keep going, one card at a time. The room fell silent. No one wanted to be the next to draw, but they all knew it was inevitable. After a long pause, Paige stood up, her hands clenched into fists. I'll do it, she said, her voice trembling. I can't sit here and wait for whatever this thing is to come after us. If we have to face it, we face it. The group watched as Paige approached the table. Her steps were hesitant, but her resolve was clear. She picked up the deck, her fingers shaking as she shuffled the cards. The air seemed to grow colder with each movement, a faint whispering sound filling the room. Finally, Paige drew a card and placed it face up on the table. It was the devil. The image on the card was chilling, a horned figure, half shadow, half flame, towering over two chained figures. Their faces were twisted with fear and anguish, but the chains around their necks were loose, symbolizing their own complicity in their imprisonment. Paige stared at the card, her breath catching in her throat. What does it mean? She whispered. Elise, already flipping through the journal, read aloud. The devil represents temptation, bondage, and the darker aspects of human nature. It reveals the chains we place on ourselves and the price we pay for our choices. To face the devil is to confront one's own desires and the consequences they bring. As the words left her lips, the temperature in the room plummeted. The lights flickered, and the faint smell of sulfur filled the air. The whispers grew louder, an indecipherable cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Paige stumbled back, her hands clutching her head. I hear it. I can hear it. What do you hear? Elise asked, her voice shaking. Voices, Paige said, her eyes wide with terror. They're calling me, they're mocking me. Suddenly, the shadows in the room began to shift and coalesce, forming a dark figure in the corner. It was tall and featureless, its body flickering like smoke and fire. The figure stepped forward, and with each movement, the air grew heavier. No, Paige whispered, backing away. This isn't real. It's not real. The figure tilted its head, as though studying her. Its voice was deep and resonant, echoing in their minds rather than the room. You cannot run from yourself, Paige. You carry your chains wherever you go. Paige shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what you're talking about. The figure raised a hand, and the room seemed to shift. The others watched in horror as Paige's surroundings dissolved, replaced by a twisted, surreal landscape. She was standing in the middle of a massive, cracked expanse, chains snaking out of the ground and wrapping around her ankles. The dark figure appeared before her, its presence overwhelming. Do you recognize this place? It asked. Paige looked around, her chest heaving. No, I've never been here before. Liar, the figure hissed. This is the prison of your own making. Every lie, every betrayal, every selfish act. Each one forged a link in the chain. The chains around her tightened, pulling her to her knees. Paige struggled, but the more she fought, the tighter they became. Stop it, she screamed. Let me go. The figure leaned closer, its voice a whisper that cut through her like a blade. You hold the key. Admit the truth, and the chains will break. Deny it, and you will remain bound forever. Paige's mind raced. Memories flooded back. Times when she had lied to protect herself, manipulated others to get what she wanted, ignored the consequences of her actions. She had always justified it, telling herself it was necessary. But now, faced with the weight of it all, she couldn't deny the truth. I was selfish, she said, her voice breaking. I hurt people. I lied. I didn't care about anyone but myself. The chains slackened slightly, but the figure remained unmoved. And do you regret it? Paige hesitated. Regret? She had always seen her choices as necessary, a means to an end. But as she looked at the chains binding her, she realized they weren't just holding her. They were a part of her. Yes, she said finally. I regret it. I regret all of it. The figure stepped back, its form flickering. Then break the chains, Paige. Release yourself. Paige reached down and grasped the chains. They were cold and heavy, but as she pulled, they began to dissolve into ash. The landscape around her shifted again, and she found herself back in the parlor, the others staring at her in shock. She collapsed into a chair, her body trembling. "It's done," she whispered. "I faced it." Haley placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You were brave, Paige. You didn't let it win." The tarot deck sat silently on the table, its presence more menacing than ever. The group exchanged uneasy glances, knowing this was far from over. 2 cards had been drawn, but the deck still held its secrets and its horrors. "We need to keep going," Haley said, her voice resolute. "Are you serious?" Lucas snapped. "This thing is killing us. We don't even know if breaking the curse is possible." "We don't have a choice," Grant said, his voice grim. "If we stop now, the curse will consume us." Paige faced her darkness, and she's still here. "We can do this." Lucas threw his hands up in frustration. "Fine, but don't expect me to be next." As the group settled into uneasy silence, the tarot deck seemed to hum with dark energy, waiting patiently for the next soul to face its judgment. Chapter 6. The Tower's Collapse. The night was restless. Despite the exhaustion that weighed on their bodies, sleep was a fleeting luxury for the group. The house creaked and groaned as if alive, and every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like an unseen entity clawing to get in. For those who managed to sleep, their dreams were filled with the haunting echoes of Paige's screams and the oppressive presence of the dark figure she had confronted. Morning came slowly, the pale light of dawn casting long shadows across the parlor. The tarot deck sat in the center of the table, unmoved yet omnipresent. Its influence seemed to permeate the very air, suffocating and relentless. Lucas was the first to speak, his voice sharp with anger and fear. "We're wasting time. We should destroy that damn deck. Burn it, shred it, do whatever it takes to end this." Haley shook her head, her tone firm. "We can't. The journal warned about that. If we try to destroy it, the curse will lash out. It'll get worse. It's already worse." Lucas snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Paige almost died. We're being toyed with, one by one, and you want to play along." "Lucas," Grant said calmly, though his eyes betrayed his own fear. "Yelling isn't going to change anything. We've come this far. We have to finish what we started. And how many more of us have to suffer before we're finished?" Lucas demanded. "Enough," Elise said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. "Arguing won't help. We all agreed to face this together, and that hasn't changed. Let's just get through the next draw and see where it takes us." Her words silenced the group, though the unease remained. After a long pause, Grant stepped forward. "I'll go next," he said. Haley looked at him, concern etched across her face. "Grant, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "If we're going to break this curse, we can't keep hesitating. The sooner we face it, the sooner we get out of here." The group watched in silence as Grant approached the table. He picked up the deck, his hands steady despite the fear that lingered in his eyes. Slowly, he shuffled the cards, the soft rustling sound filling the room. Then, with a deep breath, he drew a card and placed it face up on the table. It was the tower. The card depicted a tall, crumbling tower struck by lightning, flames consuming its walls as figures tumbled from the windows. The artwork was chaotic, almost alive, the destruction leaping off the card. Elise opened the journal with trembling hands and read aloud. "The tower signifies sudden upheaval, destruction, and the breaking of false foundations. It is the end of comfort and the beginning of transformation. What is built on lies will crumble, but from the ruins, truth can emerge." The words hung heavy in the air. Grant stared at the card, his expression unreadable. Then the room trembled. "What's happening?" Paige cried, clutching the edge of the table. The walls shuddered, and the chandelier above them swayed dangerously. A deafening crack echoed through the house as the floor beneath Grant splintered. Before anyone could react, he was gone, swallowed by the collapsing floorboards. "Grant!" Haley screamed, rushing to the edge of the hole. The others followed, peering into the darkness below. Grant lay in a heap, groaning in pain but alive. He was in what appeared to be a hidden chamber, the walls lined with crumbling stone and faded tapestries. "Grant, are you okay?" Elise called down. "Yeah," he groaned, sitting up. "I think so. Just give me a second." The group scrambled to find a way down, eventually locating a narrow staircase hidden behind a bookshelf. When they reached the chamber, they found Grant standing in the center, staring at something on the far wall. "What is it?" Haley asked, stepping closer. Grant pointed to a large mural painted on the wall. It depicted a tower much like the one on the card, but its details were hauntingly familiar. The tower was the mansion, its spires and turrets unmistakable. Surrounding it were shadowy figures, their faces twisted with anguish and rage. "This place, it's part of the curse," Grant said, his voice hushed. "It's been here all along." As they examined the mural, another tremor shook the chamber. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and a deep, guttural sound echoed through the space. "We need to get out of here," Lucas said, his voice tight with panic. But as they turned to leave, the shadows in the room began to move. They slithered across the walls, converging in the center of the chamber to form a towering figure. It was humanoid but grotesque, its body a mass of writhing darkness. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its voice rumbled like thunder. "You dare to defy the tower's judgment?" it bellowed. The group froze, their terror paralyzing them. Grant stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What do you want from us?" The figure leaned closer, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "The truth," it said. "Your lies, your deceit, your false foundations, they must fall, or you will perish with them." Grant's mind raced. He thought of his life, of the choices he had made. He had always prided himself on being dependable, a rock for others to lean on. But beneath that facade was a man who hid his fears, his failures, and his insecurities. I lied," he admitted, his voice shaking. "I told myself I was strong, but I'm not. I'm scared, and I've made mistakes. I built a life on pretending I was someone I'm not." The figure loomed over him, its form flickering. "Do you accept the collapse of your tower? Will you rebuild on truth, or will you crumble beneath the weight of your lies?" Grant took a deep breath, his fear giving way to resolve. "I'll rebuild," he said. "No more lies." The figure roared, its body exploding into a burst of light and shadow. The tremors ceased, and the chamber fell silent. When the group emerged from the hidden chamber, they found the parlor unchanged. The tarot deck still sat on the table, waiting for its next victim. Grant sank into a chair, his body trembling. "It's not just about surviving," he said quietly. "It's about facing who we are. The curse is testing us, forcing us to confront our darkest truths." The others nodded, their fear mingled with a growing understanding. The tarot deck wasn't just a curse, it was a mirror, reflecting the truths they had tried to hide. But as they prepared for the next draw, a chilling realization settled over them. The cards were running out, and with each one, the challenges grew more terrifying. The tower had crumbled, but the storm was far from over. Chapter 7. Judgment Awaits. The air in the mansion was thick with tension. After Grant's ordeal, no one wanted to approach the tarot deck. Its silent presence in the parlor felt heavier than ever, as though it were alive and waiting. They had begun to understand the cruel purpose of the cards. They weren't simply about punishment. Each draw was an unrelenting confrontation with their deepest flaws, fears, and regrets. The group sat in uneasy silence. Haley stared at the deck, her brow furrowed. Paige fidgeted with her hands, her eyes darting to the others as if silently begging someone else to step forward. Lucas paced back and forth, his frustration barely contained, while Elise and Grant exchanged quiet looks of determination. "We can't keep stalling," Haley said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her fear. "The longer we wait, the worse it's going to get. We've all seen that by now." "I've had enough of this," Lucas snapped, his voice edged with anger. "We're playing right into whatever sick game this is. What if we just leave? Forget the cards, forget the curse, and get the hell out of here." Paige shook her head. "You think it'll let us leave?" The journal was clear. "If we don't finish, the curse doesn't stop. It'll follow us wherever we go." "And you trust that journal?" A bunch of scribbles from someone who probably lost their mind dealing with this same nightmare. Lucas countered, his pacing growing more frantic. "It's not about trusting the journal," Elise said, her tone calm but insistent. "It's about the fact that none of us have a better plan. Do you?" Lucas stopped in his tracks, his jaw tightening. He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He was terrified, just like the rest of them. After a long silence, Elise stood. "I'll go next," she said, her voice steady. The others turned to her in surprise. "Elise, you don't have to," Grant began, but she cut him off with a sharp glance. "Yes, I do," she said. "We're running out of time, and the longer we argue, the worse this is going to get. Let's just get it over with." Without waiting for a response, Elise walked to the table. She picked up the deck and shuffled it, her movements precise and deliberate. The room seemed to grow colder as she drew a card and placed it face up on the table. It was Judgment. The card depicted a horned angel blowing a trumpet, the sound calling forth figures from their graves. The artwork was vivid, the angel's eyes glowing with an eerie light, the figures beneath it reaching toward the heavens. Elise stared at the card, her expression unreadable. "What does it mean?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Haley opened the journal, her hands trembling. She read aloud. "Judgment signifies reflection, reckoning, and the weighing of one's soul. It is the call to account for one's actions, the final assessment of one's worth. To face judgment is to face the ultimate truth." As the last word left her lips, the room was plunged into darkness. A chilling wind swept through the parlor, carrying with it a faint sound like the tolling of a distant bell. "Elise!" Paige's voice was shaky, the fear in it palpable. But Elise didn't respond. Her surroundings had shifted, leaving her alone in an endless, featureless void. The ground beneath her was smooth and cold, like polished stone, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. Ahead of her, a figure began to materialize. It was tall and imposing, its form cloaked in shadow. In its hand, it held a massive scale, one side tipped precariously low, the other empty. "Elise," the figure intoned, its voice deep and resonant. "You stand before judgment. Your deeds will be weighed, and your soul will be measured." Elise swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "I've faced my fears," she said, her voice trembling. "I've survived this far. What more do you want from me?" The figure's eyes glowed faintly, two orbs of golden light that seemed to pierce through her. "You have survived, but survival is not the measure of truth. You have hidden, Elise. Hidden from others, hidden from yourself. The time for hiding is over." The scale in its hand began to glow, and images appeared in the air around Elise, fragments of her past, moments she had buried deep. She saw herself as a child, stealing money from her mother's purse and lying about it. She saw herself in college, betraying a close friend to gain favor with a professor. She saw herself as an adult, turning a blind eye to those in need, always justifying her selfishness with excuses. "No," Elise whispered, backing away. "I'm not like that anymore. I've changed." "Have you?" the figure asked, its tone unyielding. "Or have you merely buried your guilt beneath a facade of righteousness?" The scale tipped further, the glowing images swirling faster around her. Elise fell to her knees, clutching her head as the memories bombarded her. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I've made mistakes, but I've tried to do better. Doesn't that count for something?" The figure was silent for a long moment. Then the scales began to shift. The side weighed down with her sins rose slightly, balanced by a new weight on the other side, images of her recent actions. Standing by her friends, confronting the curse, facing her fears. "Redemption is not given," the figure said, its voice softer now. "It is earned. You have begun the path, but it is not yet complete. Do you accept the weight of your past and commit to the truth, no matter the cost?" Elise hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of the others, of the terror they had all faced. She thought of the burden she carried and the strength it had taken to admit her faults. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady. "I accept it. All of it." The figure nodded, and the scales tipped to balance. The void around her dissolved, and she found herself back in the parlor. The others were gathered around her, their faces a mix of relief and worry. "Elise," Haley said, stepping forward. "Are you okay?" Elise nodded, though her body trembled. "I'm fine. It's done." As the group helped her to a chair, the tarot deck sat silently on the table, its presence a dark reminder of what still lay ahead. 7 cards had been drawn, but the deck was far from finished. And with each card, the stakes grew higher, the challenges more harrowing. The curse was not just testing their strength, it was testing their souls. Chapter 8. The Moon's Deception. The air in the mansion grew colder after Elise's encounter with Judgment. The house, once imposing but merely eerie, now felt alive, its walls pulsating with an unseen energy. Every step echoed louder, every shadow stretched farther, and the tarot deck on the table seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The group sat in silence, the weight of their predicament crushing their spirits. 3 more cards, Haley murmured, her voice barely audible. "We're almost there." "Almost there," Lucas repeated bitterly. "As if getting through this means we'll actually make it out alive." "We don't have a choice," Paige said, though her voice lacked conviction. She wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes darting to the tarot deck. It's either finish this or let the curse take us. The tension in the room was suffocating. No one wanted to volunteer for the next draw, yet they all knew someone had to. Finally, Haley stood, her movements deliberate and steady. "I'll go," she said, her tone resolute. "Haley, wait," Elise began, but Haley silenced her with a look. "No, I can't just sit here anymore. We're all in this together, and it's my turn." She approached the table, her hands trembling only slightly as she reached for the deck. The others watched in silence, their breaths held as Haley shuffled the cards. The sound of the deck moving echoed in the still room like distant thunder. When she drew her card and placed it on the table, a collective gasp filled the room. It was the moon. The card depicted a pale moon hanging in a starless sky, its surface marred by strange, dark shadows. Two wolves stood beneath it, one snarling and the other howling, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. A winding path led into the darkness, disappearing into an abyss. "What does it mean?" Paige whispered, though none of them truly wanted to know. Elise opened the journal with shaky hands and read. "The moon represents illusion, deception, and the unknown. It is the realm of dreams and nightmares, where reality twists and truth becomes obscured. To face the moon is to confront that which cannot be trusted, even within oneself." The words sent a chill through the group. Haley closed her eyes, bracing herself as the room around her seemed to shift. The light dimmed until it was almost non-existent, leaving her in a world of shadows. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the parlor. She stood on a winding path surrounded by a dense, unnatural forest. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like claws. The air was thick with fog, and the pale light of the moon overhead cast everything in an eerie glow. "Hello," Haley called, her voice trembling. The only response was the distant howling of wolves. She turned, searching for any sign of the others, but she was alone. The path stretched out before her, winding deeper into the forest. She began to walk, her steps hesitant. Every sound around her, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, made her flinch. The path seemed to shift beneath her feet, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. As she moved deeper into the forest, she began to hear whispers. Soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each step. The voices were familiar, yet strange, like echoes of memories she couldn't quite place. "Haley." She froze, her heart racing. The voice was unmistakable. It was her own. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her. They spoke of her fears, her doubts, her regrets. "You can't trust them," the voice said, cold and mocking. "They'll leave you behind, just like everyone else." "No," Haley whispered, shaking her head. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" the voice taunted. "Think about it. They only care about themselves. When the time comes, they'll sacrifice you to save themselves. Just like you would do to them." "I wouldn't." But the voice cut her off, its tone dripping with malice. "You already have." The path before her began to shift, revealing scenes from her past. She saw herself in high school, betraying a close friend to avoid being ostracized. She saw herself at work, taking credit for a colleague's idea to secure a promotion. She saw herself walking away from someone in need, convincing herself it wasn't her problem. "No," Haley said, her voice cracking. "That's not who I am anymore." The forest seemed to laugh around her, the sound echoing through the trees. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening cacophony. Haley fell to her knees, clutching her head. "Stop," she screamed. "Stop it." The voices ceased, replaced by a heavy silence. When Haley looked up, she saw two figures standing before her. They were identical to her, mirror images that reflected the worst parts of herself. One was cold and calculating, her eyes filled with malice. The other was weak and trembling, her face etched with fear. "You can't run from us," the first figure said, her voice sharp and cruel. "You can't hide," the second whispered, her tone pitiful and broken. Haley clenched her fists, forcing herself to stand. "I'm not running," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "And I'm not hiding. I've made mistakes, but I'm not that person anymore." The two figures exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Then they stepped aside, revealing the path ahead. "You'll have to prove it," the first figure said. "And the truth isn't always kind," the second added. Haley took a deep breath and stepped forward. The path wound through the forest, leading her to a clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center stood a massive mirror, its surface rippling like water. She approached it cautiously, her reflection staring back at her. But as she looked closer, she saw something else, shadows moving within the glass, their forms shifting and writhing. "Face the truth," a voice echoed, though it came from nowhere and everywhere. Haley hesitated, her hand hovering over the mirror's surface. Then, with a deep breath, she reached out and touched it. The world around her dissolved into light and shadow, and she found herself back in the parlor. The others surrounded her, their faces filled with concern. "Haley," Elise said softly. "Are you okay?" Haley nodded slowly, her body trembling. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was barely a whisper. "I saw things. Parts of myself I didn't want to face. But I think I'm stronger now." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the curse pressing down on them. 8 cards had been drawn, and only 2 remained. The moon had tested Haley's resolve, forcing her to confront her inner demons. But the deck's trials were far from over, and the final cards promised challenges even greater than those they had faced before. The end was near, but so was the breaking point. Chapter 9. The Tower's Fall. The silence in the room after Haley's ordeal was suffocating. The group sat motionless, staring at the deck on the table as though it were a coiled snake ready to strike. The light in the parlor flickered, the mansion itself seeming to groan under the weight of the curse. Elise, Grant, Paige, Haley, and Lucas avoided meeting each other's eyes, the strain of the previous trials etched deeply into their faces. Lucas broke the silence, his voice sharp and bitter. "I've had enough of this." "None of us want to keep going, Lucas," Paige said quietly. "But we have to." "No, we don't," he snapped, standing abruptly. "We could burn the damn deck, tear this house apart if we have to. There has to be another way." Elise shook her head, her voice calm but firm. "We've seen what happens when we try to fight it. The curse isn't just in the cards, it's in us now. There's no escape unless we finish this." Lucas glared at her, his jaw clenched. "You're so sure about that, aren't you? Maybe you're the one who's wrong. Maybe we're just playing into its hands." "Lucas," Grant said, his tone warning. "This isn't helping." "Helping?" Lucas laughed bitterly. "None of this is helping. We're all going to die here, and you're just sitting there waiting for your turn like lambs to the slaughter." Haley stood, her voice trembling but resolute. "Then why don't you take the next turn, Lucas? Prove us wrong. Or are you too afraid?" The challenge hung in the air, the room so silent that the faint creak of the mansion settling sounded deafening. Lucas's eyes darted between them, anger and fear warring in his expression. Finally, he let out a frustrated growl and strode to the table. "Fine," he said, grabbing the deck. "I'll show you all." He shuffled the cards roughly, the sound harsh in the stillness. When he drew a card and slammed it onto the table, his hand trembled despite his bravado. It was the tower. The image was stark and violent, a towering structure struck by lightning, its top crumbling as flames consumed it. Figures tumbled from the heights, their faces twisted in terror, as the ground beneath the tower split apart. Haley opened the journal with shaking hands, reading aloud. "The tower represents sudden upheaval, destruction, and the collapse of illusions. It is the shattering of falsehoods, a violent awakening that leaves nothing untouched. To face the tower is to endure complete and utter ruin, and to find strength in rebuilding." Before anyone could react, the room was consumed by a deafening crack of thunder. The floor beneath Lucas's feet gave way, and he plummeted into darkness. "Lucas!" Paige screamed, rushing to the edge of the gaping hole that had appeared in the center of the room. But he was gone, swallowed by the void. The others stared in horror, the reality of the curse sinking deeper into their bones. Lucas landed hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. He groaned, rolling onto his back, only to find himself staring up at a sky filled with swirling storm clouds. He was no longer in the mansion. Instead, he stood at the base of a massive tower, its jagged spires piercing the heavens. The ground around him was cracked and barren, the air heavy with the scent of ash. "What the hell?" he muttered, pushing himself to his feet. The tower loomed before him, its structure impossibly tall and foreboding. Lightning arced across the sky, illuminating the cracks that spread like veins across its surface. "You think you're in control, Lucas?" A voice echoed, cold and mocking. He turned, searching for the source, but found only emptiness. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing back at him. The voice laughed, a low and sinister sound. "You've spent your whole life building your walls, haven't you? Hiding behind your arrogance, your anger, your need to be better than everyone else. Shut up, Lucas shouted, his fists clenched. But walls can't protect you forever, the voice continued. Eventually they crumble. And when they do, they take everything with them. The ground beneath Lucas began to tremble, cracks forming and spreading outward. The tower groaned, its spires swaying dangerously. Lucas took a step back, fear clawing at his chest. This isn't real, he said, as though saying it aloud would make it true. It's just another trick. Is it? The voice asked. The cracks in the ground widened, and Lucas stumbled, barely keeping his balance. The tower began to collapse, massive chunks of stone crashing to the earth around him. Stop it, he shouted, panic rising in his voice. I don't deserve this. Don't you? The voice asked, colder now. Think of all the people you've hurt, all the bridges you've burned. You built this tower, Lucas. You chose to stand on the wreckage of others. Now it's falling, and you're falling with it. The world around him erupted into chaos. The tower disintegrated, its pieces raining down in a storm of destruction. Lucas ran, dodging falling debris, but the ground beneath him crumbled, leaving him with nowhere to go. Please, he screamed, his voice breaking. I'll change. I'll do better. Just stop this. The voice laughed one last time, and the ground gave way entirely. Lucas fell, his scream echoing into the void. Back in the parlor, the others watched in horror as Lucas reappeared. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling violently. Lucas! Paige cried, rushing to his side. He looked up at her, his face pale and tear-streaked. It's gone, he whispered, his voice hollow. Everything I built, everything I thought I was, it's all gone. Paige hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. You're still here, she said softly. That's what matters. The others exchanged uneasy glances. The tower had done its work, tearing Lucas down to his core. But there was no time to dwell on the fallout. 9 cards had been drawn. Only one remained. And they all knew the final card would be the worst of all. Chapter 10. The World Reversed. The mansion seemed to hold its breath as the group gathered around the table for the final draw. The room was deathly silent, the flickering candlelight casting ominous shadows on their faces. Elise, Grant, Paige, Haley, and Lucas sat in a tight circle, each of them acutely aware of the gravity of the moment. The deck of cards lay in the center, the last card waiting to be drawn. The air was thick with tension, an oppressive weight pressing down on them all. 9 cards had been drawn, each one pushing them closer to the brink. Each of them bore scars, some physical, others emotional, from the trials they had faced. And now, the end was finally here. No more stalling, Elise said, her voice steady but quiet. This is it. 1 card left. Grant glanced at her, his face pale and drawn. Who's going to draw it? I will, Paige said suddenly, her voice firm. Paige, Haley began, but Paige cut her off with a raised hand. No, I've spent too long letting others make sacrifices while I stood on the sidelines. Not this time. If this is the last card, I'll be the one to draw it. The others exchanged hesitant glances, but no one objected. Paige reached out with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against the top of the deck. The card felt cold to the touch, as though it were alive, its energy pulsing beneath her skin. She drew it slowly, almost reverently, and turned it over. The group leaned forward, their collective breath hitching as they saw the image on the card. It was the world reversed. The card depicted a circular wreath, its edges frayed and broken, enclosing a crumbling landscape. For elemental figures, a lion, a bull, an eagle, and an angel hovered around the wreath, their forms distorted and grotesque. The central figure, a woman holding 2 wands, was upside down, her serene expression twisted into one of anguish. Elise opened the journal one last time, her hands shaking as she read. The world reversed signifies incompletion, stagnation, and chaos. It is the denial of fulfillment, the shattering of unity, and the destruction of harmony. To face the world reversed is to confront the collapse of all things, the ultimate unraveling. The words sent a chill through the group, their meaning settling over them like a shroud. What does that mean? Lucas asked, his voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, the room around them began to shift. The walls groaned and twisted, the floor buckling beneath their feet. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. It's starting, Elise said, her voice tight with fear. The mansion began to disintegrate, its walls peeling away to reveal a swirling void of darkness. The furniture crumbled into dust, the ceiling collapsed, and the floor beneath them dissolved, leaving them suspended in a vast, empty expanse. The group found themselves standing on a floating platform of cracked stone, surrounded by an infinite abyss. The platform was illuminated by a cold, unnatural light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. In the distance, they could see the fragments of the mansion drifting through the void, the remnants of the life they had known now scattered and meaningless. "What is this place?" Paige whispered, clutching her arms around herself. "The end," Elise replied grimly. "This is what the card meant. The unraveling of everything." A deep, resonant voice echoed through the void, its tone both melodic and menacing. "You have come far, mortals. But the final test awaits." The group turned, their eyes widening as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a towering entity, its form shifting and flickering as though it were made of light and shadow intertwined. Its face was obscured, but its presence was overwhelming, radiating power and malice. "Who are you?" Haley demanded, though her voice trembled. "I am the one who holds the threads of fate," the entity replied. "The architect of this trial, the weaver of the cards. You have drawn the world reversed, and now you must face its truth." The platform beneath them began to crack, and the group stumbled, struggling to keep their balance. "What do you want from us?" Grant shouted. "The curse was never about survival," the entity said. "It was about revelation. To strip away your illusions, to lay bare the essence of who you are. You have seen your fears, your failures, your flaws. And now you must decide." "Decide what?" Elise asked, her voice sharp. "Whether to rebuild or to succumb," the entity said. "The world reversed is the collapse of all things, but it is also the opportunity to begin anew. Will you rise from the ashes, or will you be consumed by the void?" The platform splintered further, and the group was forced to move closer together, their fear and desperation palpable. "We can't do this," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "We're not strong enough." "Yes, we are," Paige said, her tone fierce. "We've made it this far. We can finish this." "How?" Haley asked, her eyes filled with tears. "We don't even know what to do." The entity raised a hand, and the tarot deck appeared in its grasp. The cards glowed with an ethereal light, their edges shimmering like fire. "Choose," the entity said, extending the deck toward them. "One card. The final draw." The group hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. "It has to be all of us," Elise said finally. "Together. We started this together, and we'll end it the same way." The others nodded, their fear giving way to determination. They reached out as one, their hands touching the deck. The cards shimmered, and the top card rose, turning over to reveal its face. It was the Fool upright. The image was simple yet profound. A young figure standing on the edge of a cliff, a small bag slung over their shoulder, and a white rose in hand. Their face was serene, their eyes fixed on the horizon, unafraid of the abyss before them. "The Fool," Elise whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "A new beginning." The entity's form began to dissolve, its voice echoing one last time. "You have chosen wisely. The cycle ends, and the path begins anew. Step forward and claim your freedom." The platform beneath them solidified, the cracks mending themselves as light filled the void. The group felt a strange warmth envelop them, their fear and pain melting away. One by one, they stepped forward, the tarot deck disappearing as they crossed the threshold. The void dissolved, replaced by the familiar sight of the mansion's front yard bathed in the light of dawn. They stood in silence, the weight of their ordeal heavy in the morning air. The mansion loomed behind them, its once ominous presence now hollow and lifeless. "It's over," Paige said, her voice barely audible. "Is it?" Lucas asked, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Elise nodded. "The curse is broken, but that doesn't mean everything is fixed. We still have to face the consequences of what we've been through." Haley looked down at her hands, which no longer trembled. "Maybe that's the point. To learn, to grow, to start over." The group exchanged quiet nods, their shared experience binding them in a way that words could never express. As they walked away from the mansion, leaving the cursed deck and the horrors it had wrought behind, they felt a strange sense of peace. The trials had scarred them, but they had also forged them into something stronger. The world awaited, a blank slate filled with possibilities. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were ready to face it. Thank you for listening. We want to take a moment to thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey through tarot, the final draw. Your time, attention, and support mean the world to us. Every listener helps bring these stories to life, and we're grateful to have you as part of our storytelling community. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider leaving a like, sharing it with friends, and subscribing for more gripping narratives. Your feedback inspires us to keep creating, and your support fuels our passion for storytelling. Thank you for listening, and we can't wait to share more adventures with you soon. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, every story has its own magic waiting to unfold. Headphone until next time.